Hi friends, today we're going to talk about the Jeffersonian Revolution and the time period in the United States during Jefferson's presidency from 1800 to 1809. So let's go ahead and begin. In 1800, Jefferson narrowly beats John Adams out of his second term. He's aided by the help of Aaron Burr, who helped sway the New York electorate, and the Three-Fifths Compromise, or the Three-Fifths Clause in the Constitution, because Jefferson was mainly, due to that, able to carry the Southern and some Midwestern states. And as you'll remember, the Three-Fifths Compromise stated that in slaveholding states, for every slave, each slave would count as 3/5 of a person towards the total state's population count, which gave the southern slaveholding states a higher representation in the House of Representatives, and as such, a higher electoral college number. So this is one of the ways that southern states were able to dominate in the early republic in terms of Congress and the executive branch. So the election of 1800 was pretty interesting for several reasons, the first of which is that there was a tie between Burr and Jefferson, who were of the same political party. They received the same number of electoral college votes. Now, the original Constitution required that the Electoral College electors cast a single ballot with two names, but it didn't distinguish between president and vice president. And so the candidate with the majority would become president, and then the runner-up gets to serve as vice president. And as you'll recall, in 1796, this election led to a president and a vice president of two different parties. We had John Adams of the Federalist Party, who was the president, and Thomas Jefferson of the Democratic Republicans, who was vice president, which is a pretty interesting concept if you think of it. It's kind of crazy to imagine this day and age President Obama having a vice president of, say, John McCain or Mitt Romney. And the reason that that's so crazy now is because of the election of 1800. That in 1800, the top two candidates, as I said, were from the same party, and they received actually the same number of votes. So there was no majority. So according to the Constitution, this issue would go to the House, where each state would get one vote. And ultimately, the Federalist-controlled Congress at the time decided to go with Thomas Jefferson because they feared that Aaron Burr might be too radical of a Democratic Republican, and Thomas Jefferson proved a little bit more of a compromiser. So Thomas Jefferson ends up winning the election, and at that time people in Congress were like, oh yeah, maybe we should probably do something about the fact that there's no stipulation between president and vice president. So out of this election of 1800, we end up with the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, which does differentiate between president and vice president. It's why today you would never really see two different parties running on the same presidential ticket. So Jefferson considers his election, by his account, a revolution, and he calls it a revolution similar to 1776. It's not quite true, right? Because Adams only lost by a small margin. Adams, by the way, is the first and last Federalist president. George Washington, even though he tended to sympathize with Federalist ideology, also, as you'll remember, did not like political parties. So he would not have identified himself as a Federalist or a Democratic Republican because he didn't believe in the institution of political parties. And after John Adams, the Federalists are never able to make it into executive office again before then dying out. So we'll come back to that later when we talk about Madison. So Jefferson calls himself a revolution. It's not quite true because he loses to Adams by a small amount, and there also was no mass mobilization of the people like we see in the 1776 revolution. However, Jefferson didn't really consider this a revolution because it was a literal revolution like 1776, but rather because it was a return of revolutionary ideology that was present in 1776. He believed that Washington and Adams broke with the ideals of the American Revolution and betrayed the revolution by expanding government power. Also, what was incredibly revolutionary is that this was a peaceful transfer of power from one political party, the Federalists, to another, the Democratic Republicans, in an election that all parties accepted. That's a pretty big deal. It's something that we tend to take for granted in places like the United States, though in states like Egypt, this continues to be an issue. And so you have to remember that this is a very fledgling nation in 1800. The rest of the world is looking at the United States as if it's some grand experiment, is what people refer to it as. And so the fact that there was a transfer of power without people revolting, without people trying to completely dismantle the government, shows that that experiment is working for the most part. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about Thomas Jefferson. So it's important probably to get a little background on him. And was a man that deeply believed that an agrarian society was the most democratic society. And the reason for that is because if each man is a farmer, according to Jefferson, then each man gets to be his own king. He was also incredibly aristocratic in appearance, as seen by this saucy portrait included in the presentation. But he was also very humble in his manner, sometimes to a fault. Sometimes people didn't appreciate the fact that he got rid of certain protocol because he thought it was too aristocratic or kingly. Especially foreign dignitaries, when they were visiting, were kind of thrown by the fact that the seating arrangements at dinner parties were different, that all of the important people weren't sitting in special spots, that anybody could kind of sit with anybody, and that put a lot of people off. He also received several criticisms about his dress. Sometimes people were really offended by the fact that he would host people in his slippers or in some slovenly attire. So in his first inaugural address, he discussed the power of the majority while also recognizing the importance of protecting the rights of the minority. And remember, put this in context, right? The Democratic Republicans are now the new majority, and the Federalists who were in power are now the minority. So basically, he's trying to assuage Federalist fears, saying, don't worry, guys, I got you. You may be the minority now, but that doesn't mean that we are not going to protect your rights as well as everybody else's. He also promised honest friendship with foreign countries, but said that he would pledge allegiance to none, again, trying to maintain that precedent of Washington's neutrality. And what's interesting about Thomas Jefferson is that the philosopher side of him often clashed with the Thomas Jefferson who was the politician. And his presidency exemplifies the struggle between his philosophical ideals and his obligations as head of state. So one of the first things that happens during his presidency is the Louisiana Purchase, one of the first major things that we're going to talk about. And this happens in 1803. The Louisiana Territory is a large tract of land which holds the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers. And of course, at the mouth of the Mississippi River is the valuable port of New Orleans. So New Orleans, Louisiana Territory in general was controlled by Spain at the time. But in 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte forces Spain to give the territory back to what he refers to as the original owners, the French. But of course, we know that the original owners were not the French, that people were inhabiting these lands long before any Europeans came to it. But that's what, of course, grandiose Napoleon Bonaparte thought. So Napoleon wanted to extend the French Empire not only into other parts of Europe, but into the Americas as well, which is one of the reasons why he came back and claimed that land. But in 1803, he abandons his hope for expanding into the Americas. And that mainly has to do with two factors. The first factor is that he really needs to focus his resources on fighting with England. It's just not going to, he's not going to be able to spread his resources out too much. The second reason has to do with the Haitian Revolution, the most successful slave revolt in history, is taking place during this time period, mainly led by this man pictured here, Toussaint Louverture. In 1803, the French receive a massive defeat in Santo Domingo, and it forces Napoleon to reassess his resources. Of course, the Haitian Revolution will not end for another year, but it's enough to get France to start pulling back from the area. So another factor that contributes to the Louisiana Purchase is what's happening with access to the ports. So during Jefferson's presidency, the western frontier extended beyond Ohio and Kentucky into Indiana Territory. And those living in the region relied heavily on being able to transport their goods via the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. And so they were very unsettled in 1802 when the Spanish, who still controlled the port in New Orleans, closed that port to Americans. And you'll remember that in 1795, the United States brokered a deal called Pinckney's Treaty that allowed the United States tax-free use of that port. So people on the frontier were not happy at all. Jefferson worried over the economic implications of no longer having access to these ports. And he also worried that as long as a foreign power controlled the port, the U.S. would risk getting caught in these tangling alliances. So as a solution, Jefferson sends ministers to France with instructions to pay $10 million for New Orleans and the area of land extending east from New Orleans to Florida. That way the United States, accepting Florida, which is kind of, sticking out in the South anyway, can have one, uninterrupted landmass. So as a backup plan, Jefferson instructs his envoys to seek an alliance with the British if the French are not agreeable. But the French, because they're in such dire straits, agree not only to sell New Orleans, but all of the Louisiana Territory for the cool price of $15 million. So the U.S. envoys, without even really consulting Thomas Jefferson, because that would take too long, it's not like they can just Snapchat one another. They've got to carry messages via ships on the Atlantic. So these U.S. envoys go ahead and accept this offer. So we're going to talk about the problems with that offer as well as foreign policy in our next video.